Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched It Happened One Night from 1934. This is a movie I've kind of on again, off again meant to watch for a long time. It is a movie that is particularly well known for being very successful and well regarded in the time that it released. However, the year was 1934. So that has a lot of implications. I actually didn't think this movie was from the 30s, let alone the early mid 30s. I actually thought it was from the 40s, and I didn't realize that until after I had finished watching. Part of the reason I thought that was the case was because it is directed by Frank Capra, who is a pretty big name in early Hollywood cinema. In particular, movies that he made during the 40s, late 30s to early 40s, really. Possibly his most notable films, other than this one, are Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, is pretty well known. And in a more modern-ish way, It's a Wonderful Life is also directed by him. I haven't seen either of those films in quite a few years now. But it's hard to talk about Frank Capra without talking about a lot of social and political and Hollywood production things. And he's so kind of intertwined with the America of a particular era that it's a whole other subject that I'm not going to delve into in this video. In addition, a whole third video is discussion of the Hays Code, because this being 1934, it is a pre-code film, which has a lot of implications in terms of the production, but also in terms of the content. Not that I think there's anything in this movie, with the exception of possibly one scene, that is any sort of flagrant violation of the Hays Code. Maybe a little bit iffy, but not anything like that. But talking about the Hays Code itself and its importance to 35 years of cinema, or no, 45, and sort of the way that it determined the scope and content of films in America for a very long time. That's a deeply complicated topic all on its own. But this movie, for being a pre-code film, it's tame. I mean, it's not extraordinary in any way. And again, part of the reason I thought this was from the 40s or something like that was because it has all the hallmarks of being a post-code film. But I think that really has to do more with the fact that this is directed by Frank Capra than it is the code itself. It did very well, as far as I understand it, upon release, and got a lot of awards. It won at the Oscars that year. It won all 5 of the quote unquote major awards: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay, which is a particularly rare set of awards to win all of them. There's only a few others, I think 2 or 3, that have ever done that, and is generally put on a lot of lists of greatest films of all time. Now, my knowledge of 1930s and 40s and, well, 20s films is not exactly encyclopedic. I feel like I have more than the average person, but like my knowledge is not that extensive. And for all the things that are good about this film, I don't think that it warrants the kind of awards that it receives. The the As I've discussed before, the Academy Awards themselves are a shit show and always have been. And frankly, it is in no small part and always has been a popularity contest. And this movie manages to ride the line of being, well, partially because it's extra old from the 30s, but also it being somewhat novel as a result. It really sort of is a framework for a lot of sort of 30s, 40s, really into the 60s romantic comedies, but also does enough different and unique that it still stands out a little bit from a lot of other similar romantic comedy films from that whole, like basically the Hays Code era. It's reasonably wholesome while still pushing some like social boundaries. Like this is not going to be anything you wouldn't want to show to a 6-year-old or whatever. If that's your audience, that's not my audience. But anyway, my point being that just it's perfectly respectable in that respect. And like I imagine that is in no small part why it got the awards that it did. It's well produced. It is reasonably safe. It is, but while still, raising a few questions here and there, it is has well, a large scale appeal. Not insulting anyone, but still, being a little bit. It's not like there's a lot of kind of romantic comedies from this and the later era that fall into the sort of romanticization of wealth and success, more so that there was a more aspirational viewpoint for the typical viewership of the films, whereas this one I think touches on that, but also frames it as somewhat of a critique of those sorts of relationships and those sorts of the sort of people, the more upper class people than the general viewing audience. I like a lot about this film, but it doesn't stand out to me as really extraordinary. And admittedly, with it being, 95 years old now, which is, well, not 95, what, 90, 92? Wait, I can't do math. Fuck it. It's old. Like, obviously some of the novelty from the time is not going to reflect on me now. And while I can do my best to frame my mentality while watching it as what the expectations would have been at the time, that's always, a limited effort. There's only so much I can do to think with that. And there's only so much I can like force myself to enjoy something more because of a framing that I use. So there's a lot that is pretty good, but some that's not so great either. Like I said, Frank Capra had a long and storied career, and was a particular social figure a little later, basically in the post-war era, became more like interwar and post, or well, he became more of a social figure later in his career. And so, like I can say that his other films that I have seen are probably better produced overall. But that's not to say this one is shabby in any way. The production values really go up and down throughout the film, not in terms of the direction, but in terms of things like the locations that they're shooting and the quality of certain like interior shots. It's the lighting can be up and down as well. Obviously, this is a black and white film, and doesn't show some of the like finesse that that other people from the era might have had. But also, this is, relatively early in Capra's career. He's not a novice by any means at this point, but that finesse, I think, is shown off better by some of his later films. It's also an awkward one to shoot because it primarily happens during after sunset, and in locations that are not particularly well lit after sunset either. So part of me wants to see more use of the setting and the lighting to interesting artistic effect. To say like, well, we have limited light sources. What's interesting that we can do with them? Which is something I think some of his other films do better. But it's not bad by any means. There are a few shots that are kind of nice in their like use of light and darkness, intentionally silhouetting people and things like that. And it works pretty well, but it's a little bit all over the place. Production values for certain scenes also really waxes and wanes. And while it's supposed to, I guess, reflect these different worlds that the characters are passing through, some of the like shabbier but arguably more structurally important scenes are both stylistically shabby and production wise more shabby, where you just feel like not they said this was supposed to not look so great, so they didn't put that much money into it either. And I think it's not terrible. It's just that if you're using a one room like a one room sleeping arrangement or something like that to exhibit sort of a difference in standards and expectations between people, then really exemplifying what that room should look like rather than just saying, yeah, just, sort of throw things together. That would have been a little nicer to see some more of the money spent on those scenes and a little bit less spent on the pomp and circumstance scenes that are relatively few and far between, but clearly a lot of money was spent on to exemplify that there's this other side to things, that there are characters who have differences in expectations. I would imagine the vast majority of the budget is contained in, well, aside from, salaries and things, the vast majority of the budget is probably contained in about 5 minutes of the film. And I don't think it's necessary or worth it. It doesn't really tell me any more about the characters. And while there is a novelty and impressiveness to some of those things that would probably have been more impactful at the time, I can only look at it and say, well, it's just not necessary. You could have just told me that's what's going on and not shown it to me, and I would have believed you, and it would have had the exact same impact. So I have some qualms about the production there. Generally speaking, though, I like a lot of the scenes and a lot of the production. It's a little bit up and down in terms of the pacing, and I think especially at the beginning, it's a little bit slow to get its hooks into you and to tell you who to care about and why, how these interactions and characters are going to play against each other. But generally speaking, once it gets its pace, it's going on. It goes along at a pretty consistent clip and gives you a sequence of scenes that in each one gives you something a little bit different and a little bit interesting to appreciate. and to appreciate growth of these characters. The two leads are Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert, or Colbert. I'm not sure which. I imagine it's probably Colbert. It's a problem now with Stephen Colbert. Everybody calls him Stephen Colbert, even though that whole thing was a joke. Anyway, that's a digression. The as far as I'm aware, Claudette Colbert didn't have a huge lengthy stay in Hollywood, but she's quite good in this film. I think she plays this character who's supposed to be sort of very reserved at the beginning and slowly opening out and revealing things about who she really is versus who she appears to be on the surface, or who other people imagine her to be, in a really interesting way that is somewhat unique for romantic comedies, especially from this era. The agency of a female character at all is, I think, largely at question in a lot of these types of films, because socially speaking, just the women's roles in the society at the time, regardless of their social or monetary standing, meant a lot of limitations. And I think this movie, that's one of the interesting things about the movie, is to see a more liberal idea than most things preceding and anteceding this film, while also being sort of coming from the exact characters you would think would be more socially conservative, who would say, "Oh no, we've got a more like Victorian, for want of a better phrase, vision of proper social interaction," and where a lot of movies would like sort of leverage the conflicts in class ideals more to sort of synthesize conflicts where there aren't any explicitly. I think this one is very naturalistic in its it's very natural in how it presents the burgeoning relationship. The interactions between the two characters feel very, very real. And while you can tell both from their the expectations that they vocalize explicitly, as well as the ways in the body language and the indirect ways in which the two characters interact. I've lost my train of thought. They sort of they put together a really believable sort of set of conflicts, as well as reasons to see the relationship growing, to see that it's not what I would say a lot of the romantic comedies of the era portray, which is like a bunch of conflicts over and over and over for somewhat comedic reasons, followed by a sudden realization near the end that the characters are actually in love with each other. This is not that at all. It's got little teeny bits of it, because of course, for comedic reasons, but like it's much more natural. It's much more believable. In addition to Claudette Colbert being, I think, really good. Obviously, Clark Gable is a name that is very recognizable, and I think this is a great performance by him. He's a really interesting character. He's got his ups and downs. He's not entirely like the good guy, while not being, he kind of balances between being somebody who's like overly scrappy and somebody who's like overly white knightish, and I think strikes a nice balance that really brings a nuance that is often missing from romantic comedies in general, especially from this era. And the two of them have like genuine chemistry on screen, and the physicality that they both have in terms of the interactions that they are forced to have, especially where they are forced to be physically close to each other, even when they might not, neither of them might want to be, work really well. They've got good physical chemistry as well. I do think that the movie suffers a little bit in some of the later pacing, and certain scenes are definitely stronger than others in terms of like giving you the the growth of a consistent growth of the relationship. But I don't think any of that really hampers the overall quality of the relationship. It's hard to judge the end fairly because this is a movie that's so notable that it's been parodied, mimicked, satirized, and thinking only for the time and place and what it was produced, I think it is novel. It would have been novel and interesting and engaging in a way that a lot of other things weren't or wouldn't be for a little while. But again, there's only so much I can sort of suspend my historical knowledge or my expectations from a modern perspective rather than a contemporary one. So the ending is a little bit slow, and it's not as it doesn't have as much fanfare as that I think it probably would have at the time. However, I do have to sort of compliment it because it avoids the really I want to say saccharine and there's another word I want to use, but the sort of endings from a lot of 30s and 40s and 50s romantic comedy films avoids the overplayed, overdone, like falling into each other's arms, and like waving at the camera and fading to black thing, which is very overplayed, and so it avoids some of that. It avoids being like too pleased with itself, for want of a better phrase. And so I think like while a little bit possibly too subtle, I generally overall like the ending. I think it comes together in a way that is even sort of unique even now. I could probably talk about this film a bunch more and the other topics that I brought up as well, but I'm going to avoid speaking too much more on it. I think generally speaking, like I said, the production values, cinematography, the lighting, the audio, and stuff are not as polished as some of Capra's later films. I will give it more of a pass because of his experience and the age of the film. I will actually say that I believe this was rescanned relatively recently to a new scan from film, and it looks pretty exemplary in most things. There are a few scenes that are just like, oh, this lens wasn't quite right, or this like something wasn't quite right with the original production, but given the cameras of the time, which that's a whole other topic about the restrictions of cameras and film and how you couldn't really watch anything back. That's a whole other topic. Generally speaking, the actual shooting is like really nicely produced, like crystal clear, lots of nice texture on certain costumes and things. It's generally really pretty nice in that respect, but it can be a little up and down, and isn't quite as exemplary as some of its contemporary releases. So, all things considered, pretty good. There are a few editing things, like especially like some ADR stuff that's just like, why did they ADR that or something like that? But nothing too distracting for more than a few seconds. I think as I'm talking about this, I'm realizing that I like it more than I thought I did. I have a lot of compliments to say for it. My overall feeling is that it's like it's not really extraordinary. If you never ever watched it, you would not be greatly missing out on some piece of film history. But I think for the time and place and for understanding cinema as a whole, I think it's notable enough. And with it not being super long, I think it's an easy watch. And if you're in the mood for something, an old romantic comedy that isn't, all the same as all the other ones, you might get a little something extra here. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.